Welcome everybody to this short lecture which focuses on Chapter 1 of our textbook. I'm Dr. Holtquist. Dr. Van Leer introduced Week 1 and part of Week 2 for you, and so I will be sharing some information that will give you some additional context into the textbook reading for this week. So, as the textbook had mentioned, right, ideologies are terms, and the term ideology itself in general is something that is difficult to define and describe. And here are a list of examples of what the term ideology has meant over time and across many different countries. The definition of ideology that we are using for this class, which is based on the textbook, is the following, right? I will let you all read that on your own. The things to really draw your attention to here too is that ideologies are more or less coherent ideas, right? They provide the basis for taking action in politics. And last week, Dr. Van Leer had defined what politics means, right? Who gets what and when and how and where, etc. And so these are systems of ideas that are meant to maintain, change, or completely overhaul an existing system of power, right? And so these are the characteristics of ideologies, which I will get into with more examples in the upcoming slides. So ideologies really do two things, right? They describe the world as it is, right? This is what this kind of blue part of this Venn diagram is meant to demonstrate. They imagine the world as it should be, the emphasis here being on the word should, which I'll get to in the next slide, right? This part of the Venn diagram. And then finally, they propose how we are supposed to get from the way that the world is to the way that we think the way the world should look. And so ideologies are really a combination of descriptive and normative elements. And so what I mean by descriptive and normative is the following, right? Descriptive, as you probably can surmise from the term itself, just describes what is, right? These are like established facts. So like, for example, in Wisconsin, the highest speed limit is 70 miles per hour, right? We can verify that. The U.S. does have lower voter turnout when we look at other established democracies, and established democracies being the ones that are not new, right? Countries that are not just recently democratizing or not that have recently democratized, but those that have been democratic for a number of years. A lot of Americans do get to work by their own private cars, and the U.S. does spend a lot of money on national defense, right? There are a whole bunch of figures that you could look at online that will demonstrate the extent to which the U.S. spends more than many of the other major big powers. Now, the normative part of ideology focuses on what should be, right? So we have some established facts, but we think that there is a reason to make changes to them, or even to keep them the same, right? So the highest speed limit in Wisconsin should be 75 miles per hour. That might be one normative claim. Maybe we think it should be 80. Maybe some people actually want to keep it at 70, right? But we're talking about the way that things should be as opposed to the way that they are. Another example of a normative claim focusing on voter turnout is that the U.S. should make Election Day a national holiday. Alternatively, right, we could say that the U.S. should institute voting that's mandatory. Some countries like Australia have this. Cities should invest more in public transit to reduce traffic, right? We might think that that's something that local governments should do based on the fact that a lot of Americans, as we know, travel to work by car. And then finally, a normative claim might be that the U.S. government should cut spending on national defense. So here's another example, right? People can agree on on facts, right? We have some descriptive elements of the way that the world works, but they can disagree on what we're supposed to do about those facts. So this is a map from a data collection project called the Gini coefficient. This measures inequality across the world. It's on a scale that ranges from 0 to 1, right? So higher values mean more unequal societies. And we can all agree in looking at this figure, and we might say in our hypothetical example that two people can in fact agree that there's economic inequality around the world, and even in their own countries, right? But they can disagree on what we should do with that information, right? Do we think that this is unjust and that the government should play a role in redistributing income or providing more social safety nets to people to reduce economic inequality? Or, some people might say, no, this is actually not the role of government. Government should not be involved in this, right? So ideologies can help us understand why people can agree on the same set of facts, the descriptive portion, but may decide that different actions need to be taken about those facts, the normative portion. The textbook had also mentioned, and kind of this previews what we will cover in this class, that there are the classic ideologies, kind of in air quotes there, right, that focused initially on economics, the role of government in economics, the role of the market in economics, and that really focused on social classes, right, kind of like classes as like distinct actors, in comparison to the newer ideologies that focus less on economics, in part because there may be less of a discussion about the different types of economic systems that are out there, but that focus more on individuals as opposed to classes of actors, like economic actors, like workers, for example, right, or business people. And then finally, the other thing that I'll mention, which will preview and relate to one of the readings that you have for this week, is that when we think about ideologies, it's natural that we want to place them in some sort of order, right? We like to make sense of the world. Maybe we think that we have this left-right spectrum that focuses on, for example, the role of individual rights, or focus on economic inequality, right? This is one way of thinking about how we might organize the ideologies and relate them to one another. As your book had mentioned, another possibility is this horseshoe, right? That maybe people who are kind of like on the either extremes of this left-right dimension are kind of closer to one another than the folks who sit in the middle. Right? We could maybe think about open and closed political leanings, and this really gets brought into the conversation when we think about globalization, which is, interconnected world in terms of transportation and economic systems and financial systems, et cetera, right? Are we more outward versus inward looking, et cetera? And then the final way that we can think about how to characterize these ideologies with each other is through the political compass, which is something that we asked you to take that quiz last week, to post your response in the Microsoft form. We're going to create sort of our class political compass. So this is a way of looking at not just like one spectrum, right, but really kind of two different spectrums, right? One that focuses on an economic scale and the other that focuses on a social scale. So that is it for this mini lecture. I look forward to reading your discussion posts for this week.